The archive room smelled like dust and forgotten promises. That was how Seren Ashvale had always described it to herself. Not in words she would ever say aloud, because there was no one in Thornwood Pack who would have listened long enough to hear her finish the sentence. But in the quiet interior language she had developed over 24 years of being largely invisible, dust and forgotten promises, the shelves rose from floor to ceiling on all 4 walls, packed with scrolls and bound, manuscripts and loose papers stuffed between leather covers, and the only window was a narrow slot high up near the rafters that let in a single blade of afternoon light each day around 3 o'clock, which moved slowly across the floor like a sundial nobody had asked for. Seren had learned to measure her reading sessions by it. When the light touched the leg of the reading table, she had 1 hour before the evening meal preparations would require her presence in the main hall kitchen. When it reached the far wall, she had perhaps 20 minutes. When it disappeared entirely, she was already late. She had been assigned to the archives 4 years ago, which everyone in the pack understood to be a polite form of exile. The previous archivist, an elderly Omega named Bessian, had died quietly in his sleep, and when Elder Voss had announced that someone needed to maintain the room, keep the dust from the shelves, ensure the scrolls didn't deteriorate further, the silence in the assembly hall had been the kind that meant nobody wanted the task. Seren had raised her hand, not because she wanted to be useful, though she did, always, with the particular desperation of someone who has been told in 1,000 small ways that their usefulness is the only justification for their continued presence. She had raised her hand because she had seen the room once, when she was 12, through an open door, and she had never stopped thinking about it. All those words, all that preserved weight of what had happened before. She had raised her hand, and Elder Voss had nodded at her with the expression of a man who had just solved a minor inconvenience. And that had been that. What nobody had anticipated, because nobody had thought about it long enough to anticipate anything, was that Seren would actually read everything. Not organize it, not dust it, not simply maintain the physical integrity of documents nobody consulted. She would read every single manuscript in that room, from the kings, crumbling territorial maps of the first settlements to the ceremonial records of every Alpha succession for 3 centuries to the philosophical treatises written by long-dead pack scholars on the nature of the wolf bond and the origin of the mate connection. She would read all of it, slowly, carefully, in the single blade of afternoon light, and by the small lamp she was allowed in the evenings. And she would remember what she read with the kind of precision that some people are born with and most never discover in themselves because they are never given enough quiet to find it. She had a perfect memory. She had never told anyone. It seemed in Thornwood like the kind of thing that would be taken from her if she mentioned it. The eagle appeared on a Tuesday in late October, during the territorial renewal ceremony that Elder Voss conducted every year, with the self-important gravity of a man who believed ritual was the same thing as meaning. Seren was not part of the ceremony. She was never part of ceremonies. She stood at the edge of the eastern field, where the pack had gathered in their formal ranks, alphas and betas in the inner circle, omegas and ranked members further out, and at the very periphery, pressed against the tree line, the small collection of unbonded, unranked, unofficially tolerated people who existed in the pack the way dust exists in a room, noticed only when someone finds it inconvenient. Seren stood among them with her hands folded and watched the ritual. She had read about in 12 different historical accounts, none of which agreed on its original purpose. The eagle appeared while Elder Voss was mid-sentence. It came from the north, which was already significant to anyone who knew the oldest texts, because the northern approach to Thornwood territory had not been called the Warden's Path in the official records for over 2 centuries, the name having been quietly removed sometime around the same period that a great many other things had been. Quietly removed. But Seren knew what it had been called. She had read it in a manuscript so old, the ink had faded to the color of old tea, written in a dialect of the pack language that nobody spoke anymore, which she had taught herself to read over the course of 8 months by cross-referencing it with later translations. She knew what the northern approach was called, and she knew what it meant when something came from that direction during a territorial ritual. The eagle was enormous. That was the first thing anyone registered, the sheer physical scale of it. Wingspan broad enough to cast a shadow across several gathered pack members as it passed overhead. Feathers the deep burnished gold of autumn light caught in still water. It circled once, then it circled again. It made no sound. Eagles, in Seren's experience and reading, were not silent animals during flight. But this one moved through the air above the packlands without a single sound. And the silence it carried was not the silence of absence, but the silence of something so old and so complete that it had moved beyond the need to announce itself. Elder Voss stopped speaking. Seren watched the elders. This was her instinct, always, when something significant happened. Watch the people who should know what it means, rather than the thing itself. She had learned more from watching Thornwood's leaders react to events than she had ever learned from any official announcement or council decree. And what she saw now, watching Elder Voss and Elder Marin and Elder Crane, was something she had not expected. Not because she was naive, but because she had not genuinely believed, until this moment, that the thing she had read about in the oldest manuscripts was real. She had believed it historically. She had believed it the way you believe in events from centuries past, as things that genuinely occurred but belonged to a different category of existence than your own present life. She had read about the first and understood him as a historical figure, a founding mythology, the kind of powerful origin story that all packs developed over generations to explain their own existence and justify their own hierarchies. She had read about the seal and understood it as a political act dressed in supernatural language, the kind of thing councils did when they wanted to neutralize a threat without appearing to act against their own foundations. She had believed all of it as history. What she saw on the faces of Elders Voss, Marin, and Crane was not the polite discomfort of people watching an unusual bird interrupt a ceremony. It was fear. Old fear. The particular kind of fear that lives in people who have known for a very long time that something is coming and have spent that time pretending, with increasing desperation, that it isn't. The eagle circled a third time, and then rose, not rapidly, but with the unhurried confidence of something that has delivered its message and has no need to wait for acknowledgement, and disappeared into the northern sky. Elder Voss resumed the ritual in a voice that was precisely 2 degrees too controlled. Nobody else seemed to notice. Seren noticed everything. If you're already feeling the weight of what's coming in this story, you're exactly where I want you. Stay with me, because this is only the beginning. She went back to the archive room that evening instead of eating dinner. This was not unusual enough to attract comment. Seren's absence from communal meals was tolerated with the same indifference as her presence had always been. She was a fixture of Thornwood, the way the archive room itself was a fixture. Useful in theory, mostly ignored in practice, existing in a category that the pack's social architecture had no precise word for. She lit her lamp and went directly to the section of the shelves she had mentally labeled in her private cataloging system as the purged materials. She had found them in her second year in the archive, tucked behind a false backing on the lowest shelf on the north wall, which she had discovered only because she had been reorganizing the territorial maps and had noticed that the shelf was approximately 9 inches shallower than it should have been based on the room's external dimensions. She had not told anyone. She had understood immediately, from the dust patterns and the deliberate concealment, that these were documents someone had decided to hide rather than destroy, perhaps. Because destroying them felt like too direct an act of erasure. Perhaps because even the people doing the hiding had some residual discomfort with simply eliminating knowledge from the world. Whatever the reason, they had hidden them instead. And whoever had hidden them had not anticipated that the next person to occupy this room would be someone who measured walls. There were 11 documents in the concealed section. Seren had read all of them multiple times. But tonight she was looking for one specific passage from the 3rd manuscript, a theological and historical treatise written in what she estimated was the late 13th century, based on linguistic markers and cross-references to external events. The author had signed only an initial, V. The handwriting was precise and slightly desperate, the handwriting of someone writing quickly, perhaps under time pressure. perhaps simply under the pressure of knowing that what they were writing might not survive long enough to be read. She found the passage without needing to search. She knew exactly where it was, had known since the first time she read it, had carried it in her memory like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. When the warden's gold returns above the boundary lands, know that the seal has begun to thin. It does not break all at once. It breathes first. It remembers. And the first will be confused by the present world, as anyone would be confused who woke from 400 years of imposed stillness into a century they did not choose. He will need an anchor. He will need a voice he can follow back to the surface. The seal was placed by 7, and it required 7 to sustain it. 5 are gone. 2 remain. When the second falls, the first walks. Seren read it 3 times, though she did not need to read it at all, having already memorized it completely. She read it because she needed the physical act of reading, needed her eyes to move across the words, needed the slight friction of the page against her fingertip as she held it, because otherwise she might convince herself that she had constructed this in her own mind, rather than found it in a document 400 years older than herself. 5 elders gone. 2 remaining. She thought about Elder Voss and Elder Marin and Elder Crane, and she counted quietly. Thornwood had maintained a council of 7 for as long as any official record showed. But she had read the succession records. She knew that over the past 200 years, as council members died or were replaced, something had shifted in who was appointed and how. The original 7 who had placed the seal, if this document was accurate, were not all elders in the contemporary sense. They were something older than that. And their lineage, according to Manuscript 5, carried the obligation of sustaining the seal in perpetuity, passing it blood to blood through generations. She counted again. Deaths, succession breaks, lines that had ended without continuation. 5. Gone? Yes. She could trace all 5. She knew which families they had been. 2 remaining. She thought about Elder Voss's face when the eagle appeared. Old fear. Very old. The eagle came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By the 3rd morning, it had become impossible to ignore, and the pack was whispering in the anxious, circular way that communities whisper when they sense that something important is being kept from them, but cannot identify precisely what. Seren heard fragments. During the kitchen work she still performed in the mornings, the scraps of conversation that passed around and through her as though she were furniture. People said it was an omen. People said omen of what, exactly? And nobody had an answer that satisfied. People said the elders would explain at the next assembly. People said the elders hadn't scheduled an assembly. That silence was itself a kind of answer, but not the kind anyone wanted to sit with. On the 3rd morning, Elder Marin came to the archive room. This had never happened before. In 4 years, no elder had ever come to the archive room. Seren was sitting at the reading table with Manuscript 7 open in front of her, a later document, less concealed, that contained oblique references to the ceiling that were legible only if you already knew what you were looking for. She heard the footsteps in the corridor, recognized by their weight and rhythm that they belonged to someone older and heavier than any of the assistants or junior pack members who occasionally stopped by to retrieve an official document, and had just enough time to close Manuscript 7 and place it beneath the stack of ordinary territorial records she kept on the table for exactly this kind of contingency before the door opened. Elder Marin was 73 years old and had been on the Thornwood Council for 40 of those years. She was a small woman with the kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but the management of something that required constant management, and her eyes, when they moved across the room and settled on Seren, were doing a calculation that had nothing to do with the official reason for her visit. Seren recognized the calculation. She had been the subject of calculations like it her whole life. Someone is deciding how much I know and how much of a problem that makes me. I need the settlement boundary records from the founding period, Elder Marin said. The original maps. Seren stood and went to the correct shelf, without hesitation, because she always knew exactly where everything was, and retrieved the relevant documents. She set them on the table and stepped back to the appropriate distance. She kept her face pleasant and empty, which was a skill she had developed so thoroughly that it no longer required conscious effort. Elder Marin looked at the maps. She did not look at them the way someone looks at documents they have come to retrieve. She looked at them the way someone looks at an alibi while they are actually thinking about something else entirely. Her eyes kept moving, briefly, and with the studied casualness of someone trying not to appear to be doing it, to the shelves along the north wall. "You've been in this room for 4 years," Elder Marin said. It was not a question. "Yes, Elder. You've read a great deal of what's here, I imagine. The maintenance work requires some familiarity with the contents," Seren said, which was perfectly true, and omitted everything important, which was exactly the relationship she had always had with honesty around people who held power over her. Elder Marin looked at her for a moment. The calculation was still running. "Some of the older materials," she said, "can be misleading. Documents from the early period were often written by people with particular agendas. Theological enthusiasts, political factions. The historical record from before the 2nd century of the Pack is not reliable in the way later records are." "I understand," Seren said. "Good." Elder Marin picked up the boundary maps. "I'll return these within the week." She left. She did not take the boundary maps with her. She had set them back on the table when she picked them up, having looked at them for approximately 4 seconds, and walked out without them. Seren stood in the silence after the door closed, and breathed carefully and thought about what had just happened, which was not a records retrieval, which was a visit, which was an assessment. She had 4 years of invisibility and a face trained into pleasant emptiness, and she thought, turning back to the shelves, that Elder Marin had not found what she was looking for. But she was also not certain. And uncertainty, in this particular situation, was something she could not afford. "Don't go anywhere. What's about to happen in this archive room will change everything, and I need you to be here for it." She began moving the purged materials that same evening, not all at once, which would have been obvious, but 1 document per day, tucked inside her clothing during her early morning walk to the kitchen, transferred to the small room she occupied in the Pack's secondary residential building, where she slept behind a door that had no lock, because people in Seren's position were not assumed to have anything worth locking away. She hid them in the lining of her winter coat, which was heavy enough to conceal the additional weight, and old enough that nobody would think to examine it. She did. This with the calm deliberateness of someone who has spent a lifetime in proximity to danger and has learned that calm deliberateness is the only thing that actually helps. She also began, for the first time in 4 years, to write down what she remembered, not the documents themselves, which she carried in her memory with perfect fidelity, but her analysis, the connections between texts, the timeline of the seal's construction, and what the documents implied about its current state. The identification of the 5 extinguished bloodlines and the 2 remaining. The instructions from Manuscript 5 about what came next. She wrote in a notebook she had purchased in the nearest human town during her 1 permitted off-territory errand per month, paying for it with the small stipend Thornwood provided to its unranked residents, which was barely enough for necessities, but had, over 4 years of careful management, accumulated into a modest sum she kept folded in the lining of that same winter coat. The notebook was ordinary, spiral-bound, the kind sold in bulk in pharmacies and grocery stores. She had 3 of them. She wrote in a cipher she had invented herself, based on a substitution system she had read about in a historical manuscript about human wartime communication, modified with enough personal idiosyncrasies that nobody who didn't know her mind could decode it without years of effort. She was being careful. She acknowledged to herself in the small hours of the night, possibly too careful, in the way that people are careful when they suspect the situation calls for more than just caution. She was being careful the way you prepare for a storm when the sky still looks clear, because you have read enough about weather to know what the pressure means. The 4th morning. The eagle did not appear. The 4th morning's absence was, in some ways, louder than 3 mornings of presence. The Pack noticed it as a relief. Seren noticed it as a sign. She had read Manuscript V's passage about what came after the gold returned 3 times. The gold does not need to circle indefinitely. It circles until it is seen. Once seen, it has completed its function. What comes next is not announcement. What comes next is arrival. She was in the archive room by 6 in the morning, 2 hours earlier than usual, because she needed to think, and thinking was easiest here, in this room that smelled like dust and forgotten promises, surrounded by the weight of what had been preserved despite every effort to lose it. She sat at the reading table with her notebook open and her cipher notes spread around her and worked through the timeline one more time. If the seal was thinning, the process was not instantaneous. Manuscript of 5 had been specific about this. It breathes first, it remembers. There would be a period of what the author had called reintegration, during which the sealed consciousness would become slowly more present, more aware, but not yet fully emerged. During this period, the text said, he would be disoriented, possibly dangerous in the way that any extremely powerful thing is dangerous when confused. He would not know what year it was. He would not know what world he had woken into. He would have 4 centuries of absence to cross, and he would have to cross it without guidance unless someone provided guidance. The text said, he will need a voice he can follow back to the surface. Seren read that line in her memory, heard it in the slightly desperate handwriting of the writer who had signed themselves only V, and thought about what it meant practically. Not metaphorically, practically. A voice, something audible, something consistent and present and anchored in the world as it currently was. Something he could hear and use as a thread to follow from where he was, in the deep suspension of the seal, back to where he needed to be, in the present, in this body, in this century. She thought about the northern approach to Thornwood territory, the Warden's path. She thought about where it led, if you followed it past the official boundary markers, past the standing stones that the pack used for territorial marking, past the old well that had not been in use for 2 centuries. She had never gone there. She had read about it. She knew, from the oldest text, where the seal had been placed. She closed her notebook. She put on her coat. She went. The northern forest in late October was the kind of cold that comes from damp rather than temperature, a pervasive chill that settled into fabric and skin and didn't release. Seren walked the Warden's path without looking at her feet, which meant she knew the path from reading rather than experience, which meant she was trusting text over terrain, which was either very sensible or very reckless depending on how accurate the texts were. The path was there. It was overgrown, barely visible under 2 centuries of disuse. But it was there, and her feet found it with the small muscle certainty of someone following a map they have studied long enough that it lives in their body rather than just their mind. She had not told anyone where she was going. This was both practical and telling. Practical because she couldn't tell anyone anything without explaining everything, and explaining everything to anyone in Thornwood was not an option she currently had. Telling because it was a clear indicator of how thoroughly she had internalized her own isolation. The thought of telling someone hadn't even occurred to her as a real possibility until she was already walking. And when it did occur to her, it arrived with the slight distance of a theoretical scenario, rather than an actual option. She was alone. She was always alone. It was, she had long since decided, simply a condition of her existence rather than a wound, which was either a healthy adaptation or an elaborate defense mechanism, and she genuinely couldn't tell which. The standing stones appeared first as shadows between the trees, then as shapes, then as the actual ancient stones they were. 3 of them in a rough triangle, carved with markings she recognized from Manuscript 2, the one written in the old dialect that had taken her 8 months to learn. She could read the carvings. They said, in the oldest form of the pack language, something that translated roughly as, "Here is kept what must be kept, until the time for keeping is done." It was not poetry. It was an instruction. The air around, the stones was different. Not temperature, not pressure, not any physical quality she could precisely name. It was more like the difference between ordinary silence and the silence of a room where someone has just stopped speaking. It had a quality of recent occupation, as if something had been here, very recently, and its presence had changed the air's character, the way a candle changes the air even after it's been extinguished. Seren stood at the edge of the stone triangle and did something she had not planned to do. She sat down. She sat down on the cold ground, folded her legs, and began to speak. She didn't plan it. She had not thought, walking here, I will speak. But she had arrived, and the air had that quality of recent occupation, and Manuscript 5 had said he will need a voice he can follow back to the surface, and she was here. And she was, in this specific moment, willing to be that voice, if it meant that the thing the elders were afraid of would come into the world on its own terms rather than being intercepted and managed and neutralized before it could do what the oldest text said it was supposed to do. She began with what she knew best. She began with the oldest history of Thornwood, the real history, not the official record, but the one she had assembled from 11 concealed manuscripts and 300 peripheral documents and 4 years of patient cross-referencing. She spoke aloud, in the way she might read to someone who couldn't see the page, carefully and clearly, and without rushing, starting at the beginning. The pack was not always called Thornwood, she said. That name came later, after the seal, chosen by the council that remained, because they wanted to erase the original name from living memory. The original name was Kalehold. It meant, in the old language, the place held by the Sky One, the place held by Kalem. The air shifted. It was not a physical shift, or it was not only a physical shift. It was more like the shift in a room when something that has been very still becomes less still, when something that has been very far away becomes less far. Seren's heart moved hard in her chest once, then settled. She kept speaking. If your heart just moved the way Seren's did, then you understand exactly why I need you to hit that like button right now. Because this story is just beginning to breathe. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. She came in the early hours, before the kitchen work, walking the warden's path in the dark with the kind of confidence in her own memory that meant she didn't need light to navigate. And she sat within the stone triangle and she spoke. She spoke the history. She spoke the geography of the packlands as they had been before the official boundaries were drawn. She spoke the names that had been removed from the records, the places and people and events that the council had spent 2 centuries systematically erasing from Thornwood's official understanding of itself. She spoke all of it from memory, clearly and steadily, as though reading to someone who was learning to find their way back to a country they'd been exiled from for 400 years, because that was what this was. She understood that. She was giving him a map, not of the territory but of the world he had left, the world he was returning to, delivered through the filter of her particular knowledge and her particular voice. And she was doing it because Manuscript 5 had said, someone needed to do it, and she was the only person who could. On the 5th morning, something changed. She had been speaking for approximately 30 minutes, working through the political history of the council's formation and the deliberate restructuring of pack law in the century following the seal, when the quality of the air shifted in a way that was clearly and unmistakably different from the subtle shifts of the previous mornings. This was not the change of something becoming less. Still, this was the change of something becoming present. It was the difference between the memory of warmth and actual warmth, and it arrived without warning, and Seren stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence that followed was inhabited. She had spent a great deal of her life in silence, enough to have developed a precise taxonomy of its varieties. And this silence had an occupant. Something was in it with her. Something was listening with the focused attention of a person who has been trying for a very long time to hear something and has finally succeeded. She did not run. She was frightened, in the way that being in the presence of something vast and old and not entirely human is always frightening regardless of how much you have read about it. But she did not run, because running would be a kind of answer she did not want to give, and also because she had, over the course of 5 mornings in this cold forest, developed something she couldn't quite call connection, but that wasn't nothing either. I know you can hear me, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. The steadiness. The way she was able to keep it level and clear, even while her hands were folded tightly in her lap. "You don't have to do anything. I'm just going to keep talking." She kept talking. The manifestation, when it happened, was not what she had imagined. She had read descriptions of the first in several documents, and those descriptions varied wildly, ranging from the poetic to the terrifying to the reverential, none of which had given her a reliable sense of what to actually expect. What she had vaguely pictured, without quite admitting to herself that she was picturing it, was something overwhelming, something that would hit her senses like a physical force, something that would make the choice for her. What actually happened was this. On the 8th morning, when she arrived at the stones, there was a man sitting on the ground inside the triangle. He was sitting with his back against the central stone and his legs extended in front of him and his head tilted slightly back. And he was very still in the way of something that has recently learned stillness rather than the way of something naturally at rest. He looked from a distance like a person. From closer, he looked like a person the way a painting of a person looks like a person. Technically accurate, composed of all the right elements, but carrying something in the quality of its light that painting and personhood both struggled to account for. He was looking at her. His eyes were gold, not figuratively or nearly, but the precise warm gold of the eagle's feathers, and they were the most watchful eyes Sirin had ever encountered. Watchful in the specific way of something that has been listening for a very long time and is only now adding sight to the information it has been gathering. She sat down at the edge of the triangle. Her heart was doing the single hard movement again, and then settling, which she was starting to think of as her body's way of acknowledging something significant without collapsing entirely. "You're more coherent than I expected," she said. His mouth moved. What came out was not quite language. Not in any language she recognized, but it had the cadence of language, the rhythm and weight of words that were reaching toward meaning. He tried again. The second attempt was closer. The third was in the old Pack dialect she had taught herself, heavily accented, slightly wrong in the way of someone working from memory of memory. "The voice," he said. "You are the voice." "I'm Siren," she said. "I'm the archivist." He considered this. Something moved through his expression that was not exactly confusion, but was in the same family as confusion. The look of someone calculating the relationship between what they know and what they are currently experiencing. "How long?" he said. She understood the question. 412 years, based on the most reliable dating I could assemble. The calculation that moved through him then was not confusion, but grief. Brief and enormous and quickly controlled. The grief of someone who has trained themselves to manage grief across a very long time and has not, she noted, entirely succeeded. It moved through him and he absorbed it. And he looked at her again with those gold, watchful eyes and said, with some effort, "You know what I am." "Yes." "You came here knowing." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The morning. Light was beginning to move through the trees in the way it moved in late October, low and lateral and the color of old honey. "Why?" he said. Siren thought about the 11 manuscripts hidden in her coat lining. She thought about Elder Marin's calculation. She thought about 5 mornings of sitting in a cold forest, speaking to inhabited silence. She thought about the writer who had signed themselves only V, writing quickly in the desperate handwriting of someone preserving something against the likelihood of its loss. "Because someone needed to," she said. "And I was the only one who could. Subscribe to this channel if you want to know what happens when an ancient sealed being and the only person who kept his story alive have to figure out how to exist in the same century together. Trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next." His name was, in fact, Calum. This was not something she had known with certainty until he confirmed it, sitting against the old stone in the early morning light, speaking in the old dialect that she could follow though she could not speak it fluently enough to respond in kind. She responded in the modern Pack language, which he appeared to understand with increasing facility, and the conversation they had that first morning was halting and fragmentary, and the most significant conversation Siren had ever had in her life, which was not a high bar given the life she had been living, but which she suspected would remain significant by any measure. He had not been sleeping for 400 years in the way that humans sleep. This was important, and she filed it carefully. He had been aware, in the attenuated and distorted way of something sealed away from full consciousness. Aware of time passing. Aware of the weight of it. Not unconscious, but not present either. Suspended in a state the old language apparently had a word for, that translated roughly as held without dying. The seal had not killed him, because the 7 who placed it had lacked either the power or the will to do that. They had instead done the next most effective thing, which was to remove him from participation in the world while leaving him intact. And then, to systematically erase the memory of him from the world's participation, so that the world would not know to look for him, and he would have nothing to return to even if the seal weakened. What they had not anticipated, 400 years ago, was Seren Ashvale, or more precisely, what they had not anticipated was the possibility that someone would find the hidden manuscripts, teach themselves the old dialect, memorize the complete historical record, and then walk alone into the northern forest every morning for 8 days to read that record aloud to a sealed consciousness that needed a voice to follow home. They tried to make you into something that had never existed, Seren said, on that first morning. Something with no history, no name, no story. They thought if they took those away from you, you'd have nothing to come back to. Calum turned those gold eyes on her and said, in the halting modern language he was assembling around him like someone recovering a skill they'd always had, but not used in a long time. But you kept them. I didn't know I was keeping them for you, she said. I just kept them because losing them seemed wrong. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was moving toward something she didn't have a name for. Something that lived in the territory between recognition and wonder, and said nothing. Sometimes the most significant responses are not words. Seren, who had spent 24 years in a community that communicated significance almost entirely in the currency of words and rank and formal acknowledgement, was only beginning to understand that. She told him about Thornwood, not the history she had already recited, but the present, the pack as it currently existed, its structure, its people, its politics, the way elder. Voss ran the council with the particular brand of confident mediocrity that characterizes people who have held power long enough to mistake their tenure for their quality. She told him about Elder Marin's visit to the archive room and the calculation she had seen running behind the older woman's eyes. She told him that she believed the remaining 2 seal holders knew what the eagle meant and were afraid of it, and that this fear was likely to translate into action. Calum listened to all of this, with the focused attention she had noticed from the beginning, the attention of someone who has spent a very long time being unable to gather information, and is now receiving it with the concentrated gratitude of genuine deprivation. He asked occasional questions that were, she noted, always practical. Not what does this mean to me, or what will I do about it, but what are their resources? What are their patterns? What are the weaknesses in the information chain between council and pack? He was thinking tactically. She appreciated tactical thinking. It was the kind of thinking she had been doing, alone and without anything to apply it to, for 4 years. The archivist, he said at one point, with the particular precision of someone choosing a word carefully. That is an official position in the pack's structure. Technically, Seren said, it's more accurately described as a place to put someone you don't want to think about. He tilted his head slightly. You don't have rank. No. Or a wolf. This was the thing she never quite knew how to respond to, the neutral, factual acknowledgement of the central definition of her status in Thornwood, the thing that made her permanently peripheral regardless of whatever contributions she might make. She had no wolf. She was the daughter of an elder and a human woman, and whatever she had inherited from each side of that, it had not included the ability to shift, the wolf self that every proper pack member carried. She was biologically half-pack, and socially less than the least. She said, no wolf. Calum considered this with the expression of someone doing a calculation she didn't have access to. In the original structure, he said after a moment, the distinction was different. The wolf bond was one kind of power. There were others. The council, when they reorganized after the seal, made the wolf bond into the only kind that counted. Seren went very still. This was not information she had found in any of the manuscripts. This was information that lived only in his memory, in the experience of someone who had been present before the reorganization. She said carefully, "What other kinds were there?" He looked at her with those gold eyes and said, "Memory, the kind that does not lose things." She felt the weight of that settle somewhere in her chest and stay there. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Is that why you could hear me when I started speaking?" "I could hear you because you were speaking," he said. "I kept listening because of what you knew. 400 years of silence, and the first voice that reached me knew my name." He paused. "Knew my history. Knew the old language. Knew which manuscripts the council tried to destroy." Another pause. "You are the only person in this pack who was paying attention." Seren thought about her years in the archive room, the long afternoons in that single blade of light, the deliberate acquisition of a skill nobody else wanted, the maintenance of documents nobody else read. She thought about raising her hand in the assembly hall when nobody else would. She thought about the particular loneliness of being the person who is always paying attention in a room full of people who have decided that attention is someone else's job. She said, "It didn't feel like power." Calum said, "It never does." This right here is why I need you to drop a comment telling me what you think about Seren, because she is carrying something she didn't know was a gift, and that is the most powerful kind of strength there is. Tell me below, what did you feel when he said it never does? There was the problem of practicality, which intruded on the philosophical weight of the moment with the particular insistence that practical problems always have. Calum could not remain at the Standing Stones indefinitely. He was more coherent each morning, more fluent in the modern pack language, more physically stable. But he was also, as she could observe, still in the process of reintegrating, still crossing the 400 years of distance between the consciousness he had been and the world he was re-entering. He needed somewhere safer than an unprotected clearing in the northern forest. He needed time to fully return, and she was running out of time to provide it quietly. Elder Marin had come to the archive room once. She would come again. Seren had no illusions about the calculation she had seen running. The Elder had not found what she was looking for, which meant she had not concluded her search, which meant the next visit would be more thorough. If the seal holders had maintained their obligation across 400 years, the level of commitment they brought to it was not the kind that stops, because an initial investigation turns up nothing. It was the kind that escalates. She needed to move Calum somewhere he could continue his reintegration without being found. She needed to do this without telling anyone, without drawing attention, without being absent from her regular routines long enough to invite question. And she needed to do it while continuing to be the invisible archivist that nobody paid attention to, which was, she was beginning to understand, actually her most powerful asset in this situation. Nobody pays attention to the person they've decided doesn't matter. Nobody monitors the movements of the woman whose only function is to keep the dust off the old papers. Nobody counts the hours of the servant who has been so completely absorbed into the background of pack life that her absence and presence register at roughly the same level of significance. She was invisible. And invisibility, it turned out, was a very specific and very useful kind of freedom. She knew the packlands. She had read every territorial map in the archive, official and unofficial, original surveys and subsequent adjustments, and the private annotations that various pack historians had added in the margins. She knew of 3 structures on the Northern Territory that appeared in the oldest maps, but not in any document from the past 2 centuries, which meant they either no longer existed or had been removed from the official record for reasons she could now guess at. 2 of them were too exposed. The third was a small stone building that had been labeled, in the oldest map, as the Warden's house, and whose location, based on the map's coordinates and her knowledge of the terrain, was approximately 40 minutes north of the Standing Stones, deep enough in the old forest that nobody with ordinary pack business would have reason to go there. She went to find it on the 9th morning, leaving an hour earlier than usual, walking in the dark with her lamp until the forest thickened around her, and the path became something only memory could follow. She found it. It was intact. Stone doesn't require maintenance the way wood does, and this building had been built of the kind of stone that resists centuries with the indifference of something that simply has more time than its adversaries. The roof had held. The interior was one room, bare and cold, with a stone floor and a single narrow window and a fireplace that, when she examined it, appeared functional. She stood in the warden's house for a long moment and thought about the word warden. It meant keeper. It meant the one who watches over. She thought about Calum calling the place Kalehold, the place held by the Sky One. She thought about the manuscript's description of him, before the seal, as the being who had watched over the original pack territory with the comprehensive attention of someone whose nature made the territory itself an extension of his awareness. The warden's house had been his house. Of course it had. And it had stood, intact, for 400 years of official absence, as though it had been waiting with the patience of stone for the moment it would be needed again. She would need to bring supplies. This was the practical problem under the practical problem. The specific weight of logistics that had to be addressed before anything else could be addressed. Food, bedding, firewood, all of it transported in small quantities over multiple days without drawing attention, because drawing attention was not something she could afford. She began the list in her mind as she walked back toward the pack, moving quickly in the early light, already calculating how to be invisible while carrying things. Was good at this. She had always been good at this. It was, as Calum had said, a form of power she had not known to name. The first full week passed in the particular exhaustion of someone doing 2 complete lives simultaneously. Seren maintained her archive duties, her kitchen shifts, her carefully calibrated social invisibility, the precise management of her presence in Thornwood that required constant attention to ensure that no behavior deviated enough from established pattern to invite curiosity. She attended the communal meals she normally attended, and skipped the ones she normally skipped, and said the right number of words to the right number of people, and allowed her gaze to move around rooms with the mild, unfocused expression she had been perfecting since childhood. She was, to all outward observation, entirely herself. And then, before dawn and after the pack had settled for the night, she was someone else entirely. She carried supplies north in her pack bag, concealed. Under archive materials, she had legitimate reasons to transport. She transferred Calum from the Standing Stones to the warden's house on the 3rd day, a journey that took longer than she had anticipated, because he was still building the consistency of his physical presence, still negotiating the relationship between the body he was inhabiting and the consciousness returning to inhabit it, and walking 40 minutes through uneven forest terrain while crossing 400 years of reintegration was apparently not a trivial undertaking. She supported his arm when the terrain was rough. He accepted this without comment, which she noted as significant. 400 years ago, she suspected, the first would not have accepted support from anyone without commentary. The reintegration was teaching him, as it apparently taught everyone who woke from it, a certain humility about the body's requirements. She lit the fire in the warden's house fireplace, and it drew cleanly, which she took as a good sign. She unpacked the food and the blankets and the small lamp, and she sat on the floor while he sat against the wall, and she continued what she had been doing since the beginning. She talked. She told him about the world, not pack politics this time, but the broader context, the human world that surrounded and interpenetrated the pack's existence, the historical changes of the 4 centuries he had missed, the developments and upheavals and transformations that had reshaped what it meant to live in this particular time. She told him about electricity and medicine, and the specific altered relationship between human and supernatural communities over the centuries. She told him about the changes in the pack's relationship with human society, the ways the boundaries had shifted from open hostility to cautious parallel existence. He listened with that gold-eyed attention and asked questions that became, day by day, increasingly complex, increasingly reflecting the mind that was reassembling behind them, a mind of considerable depth and range, and a particular kind of intelligence that she thought of as structural, the intelligence that sees the shape of systems, rather than just their components. He asked about power, and how it had changed. He asked about the relationship between formal authority and informal influence, and whether the pack's official hierarchy reflected actual power or concealed other arrangements. He asked about the elders, not as emotional targets, but as a system to understand. She answered everything. She answered with the precision and completeness she brought to everything. The archival quality of her mind applied to live information rather than historical documents, and she watched him absorb it with the focused hunger of a mind that had been starved for 4 centuries and was now eating, carefully, what it had been waiting for. She realized at some point during the second week, talking to him differently than she had ever talked to anyone, not more cautiously, which was her default mode in Thornwood, the careful management of disclosure that comes from a lifetime of learning that honesty has costs, differently in the direction of more complete, more layered. She was giving him full answers rather than answers calibrated for the reception they might receive. And the reason for this was simple. He listened in a way that did not edit her before she had finished speaking. He received what she said and engaged with it and asked for more of it, and never, not once in the growing number of conversations they had been having, made any gesture toward the implication that she had said too much, or said it wrong, or said it in a way that reflected poorly on the category she occupied. It was, she thought, the way you would talk to someone if you had never been taught to be afraid of the effect of your own words. She was starting to remember what that felt like, the unedited version of herself that had existed before the archive, before Thornwood's social architecture, before the long, careful training of invisibility. She was starting to remember it, and it was, she had to acknowledge, somewhat alarming, because once you start to remember what you were, before you learn to make yourself smaller, the smaller version becomes very difficult to maintain. Drop a like right now if you've ever talked to someone who made you remember that you used to take up more space, because Seren is about to stop, making herself small, and nothing will ever be the same. Elder Marin came back to the archive room on the 14th day, and this time she brought Elder Voss. This was different. Seren was at the reading table when they arrived, working through the official territorial records as she did every morning as part of her maintenance duties. And she heard 2 sets of footsteps in the corridor, and had enough time to settle her face and her breathing before the door opened. She stood as they entered, because standing when elders entered a room was one of those protocols she maintained with perfect consistency for exactly this kind of moment, when perfect consistency was the difference between routine and suspicion. Elder Voss did not bother with the social formalities. He was not, at his core, interested in the social formalities when he was doing something he considered more important. "We're conducting a review of the archive materials," he said. "Full inventory. We need to know exactly what's here." Serene said, "Of course, I can prepare a complete catalog. The existing index is several years out of date, so I'd want to verify each item before presenting it. I can have a preliminary inventory ready within 2 weeks." Elder Voss said, "We need it within 3 days." She said, "I understand. I'll prioritize it." Elder Marin was already moving through the room. She went directly to the north wall, and she examined the shelves there with the specific, focused attention of someone who knows what they are looking for, which Seren observed from her peripheral vision, while keeping her face directed toward Elder Voss in the posture of respectful engagement. Elder Marin's hands moved along the lower shelves. She pressed her palm against the backing. The backing was solid. Seren had replaced it 2 weeks ago, with an actual backing rather than the false one, having removed everything that had been concealed behind it. The concealed materials were now in the lining of her winter coat, and in her 3 spiral-bound notebooks, and in her own memory, which did not have a backing to press against. Elder Marin turned away from the north wall. Her face gave nothing. She said, "The inventory should include condition notes for preservation planning." "Of course," Seren said. They left. Seren stood in the silence after the door closed and breathed. 3 days. They had given her 3 days before they had full official access to every document in this room, which meant 3 days before they had the absence where the concealed documents should be, which meant 3 days before they knew that she had found them, which meant 3 days before they knew that she knew, which meant 3 days before the calculation she had seen in Elder Marin's eyes reached its conclusion. She had already moved the documents. She had already moved Calum. She had already placed herself with the exhausting foresight of someone who has spent a lifetime anticipating the moment when the space they occupy is reclaimed, in the position of being ahead rather than behind. But ahead was not the same as safe. She went to the warden's house that evening, arriving in the dark, and sat beside the fire that Calum had kept going without being asked, which was the kind of small operational development that told her his reintegration was progressing beyond the baseline she had established. She did not immediately launch into explanation. She sat for a moment and looked at the fire and thought about 3 days. Calum, who had been watching her since she entered with the attentiveness that never turned off, said, "Something has happened. They're conducting an inventory," she said. "They'll find the materials are gone. They'll know I found them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you been preparing for this?" It wasn't quite a question. She said, 4 years of preparation for a situation I didn't know specifically but understood generally. Which means I'm prepared for the concept and still working on the specific execution. He made a sound that was the first approximation of a laugh she had heard from him. Brief and rusty, the laugh of someone relearning that their body could do that. Then he said, with the serious undercurrent that the laugh hadn't displaced, "What do you need? Not what do you want. What do you need?" She noticed the word choice, filed it, said, "More time. But I can create that. The inventory will take 3 days. In 3 days I can give them something that looks complete without being complete, which buys another week at minimum before they identify the specific gaps. Then I need to be somewhere they aren't looking for me when they find those gaps. Here," he said. "Here is where they'll look eventually," she said. "The warden's house is in the old maps. If someone reads the old maps carefully enough." Is there anyone in Thornwood who reads the old maps carefully enough? She thought about this. Then, with some irony, "Besides me?" "No." "Then here," he said again, simply. Not as a declaration, but as an offered solution. The specific kind of practical contribution that people make when they have thought through a problem you have brought to them and arrived at an answer, and want you to know it's available if you want to take it. She had not, she realized, had that offered to her before. Not in that form, not with that particular directness. She said, "I'd have to leave the pack." Yes, they'd say, "I ran," that I stole from the archive. Yes, that would be my reputation in Thornwood permanently. Even if everything else resolves correctly, that would follow me. Calum looked at her across the fire with those gold eyes and said, "Would you miss it?" Thornwood. As it is. Seren thought about 24 years of calculated invisibility, and kitchen shifts, and the particular dignity of being the person everyone trusts to maintain things nobody wants to deal with. She thought about the assistant stipend, and the unlocked door, and Elder Voss's face when he assigned her to the archive as a minor inconvenience. She thought about raising her hand in the assembly hall into a silence that said clearly, "No one wants this." And she thought about how that silence had been, in the end, the best thing that had ever happened to her. "No," she said. "I'd miss the archive. Not Thornwood. The archive goes with you," Calum said. "You're carrying it." She looked at him. She thought about what it meant to have someone see the way she worked and understand it in those terms, not as a coping mechanism or an eccentricity or a sad investment in something nobody else valued, but as a genuine form of power. The archive goes with you. Yes, it did. It had for years. She had just never heard it said. "I'll tell you when," she said. "I'll be ready," he said. She spent the next 3 days creating the most meticulous, false, complete inventory of her life. It was a work of genuine archival craft. Every document cataloged with precision, condition notes detailed and accurate, cross-references impeccable, nothing technically absent that she had not legitimately transferred to other storage with proper notation. The 11 concealed manuscripts did not appear because they had not officially been there. You cannot inventory an absence if the absence has been consistently maintained. She gave Elder Voss 3 days of perfect professional work and handed him a document he could find no fault with. He took it without comment. He did not thank her. This was consistent with their entire history. She used those 3 days to continue preparing. More food transferred to the warden's house. Her notebooks secured. The winter coat with its hidden materials checked and rechecked. She said her minimal daily words to her minimal daily contacts, and ate her meals, and did her work, and maintained her invisibility with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing it so long it has become, in a complicated way, its own form of mastery. On the 4th evening, she did not return to her room. She walked north. The thing about crises is that they don't announce themselves as crises at the moment they begin. They present themselves as ordinary problems, recognizable and manageable, until the moment they aren't. Serene understood this from reading. What she had not expected was how quickly Elder Marin would identify the missing materials, not from the inventory, which was clean, but from her own memory. The Elder, apparently, had been in the archive room before, long before Seren, perhaps in the period immediately following the false backings installation. She had known, or suspected, what was behind it, and when she pressed the solid backing and felt no give, she had understood. Seren learned this later. At the time, walking north in the October dark, she knew only that she had perhaps 12 hours before a careful search of her room would produce the absence of her, notebooks and the absence of herself, and that 12 hours was enough time if she used it correctly. She reached the warden's house and found Calum already alert, standing at the window with the particular stillness of someone who has been aware for some time that something is approaching. She did not ask how he knew. She had been present for enough of his reintegration to understand that his awareness of the territory around him was not restricted to sight and sound in the ordinary human sense. He was, as the oldest manuscript had described him, of the place. The land itself was not indifferent to him. Now, she said. Where? He said. She had thought about this. She had thought about it since the moment she first understood that this moment would come, and she had not, until now, permitted herself to consider it too long, because considering it too long led to fear, and fear led to paralysis, and she could not afford paralysis. She said, "East, past the boundary. Communities within a day's walk. We can be anonymous there, in a way we can't be here." He nodded. He had, she noted, shed the last remnants of the halting uncertainty of the early mornings. He moved with the complete physical presence of someone who had fully returned, the reintegration finished or very nearly, 400 years of distance reduced to a thin membrane that was already dissolving as she watched. He was here, entirely and completely here, in a way that had weight to it, the particular weight of something that has been very long absent and has now landed back into the world with the solid irreversibility of an anchor dropped. "They'll follow," he said. "Yes," she said, "but they'll have to find us first. And I know these maps better than anyone in Thornwood." They left the warden's house and went east. The forest was dark and cold, and entirely itself, indifferent to human urgencies, and they moved through it with the focused quiet of people who have decided on a course and are executing it. Seren led and Calum followed, and she thought, with the strange clarity that crises sometimes produce, that she had never before had someone behind her who was moving in the direction she was going. She had always been alone in the direction she was going. The unfamiliarity of it should have felt wrong. It didn't. They crossed the eastern boundary in the hour before dawn, and the crossing felt like what it was. A threshold, not just territorial, but internal. The passing over of a line that, once crossed, makes certain previous arrangements permanently historical. Seren had never been past the boundary except for her monthly errand runs to the nearest human town, and those had been monitored and time-limited and conducted with the specific psychological framing of someone who knows they are on borrowed time before they must return. This was not borrowed. This was chosen. She stopped just past the boundary markers and stood for a moment with the old forest behind her and the eastern terrain opening in front of her. Low hills and scattered human settlement, and the sky beginning to go gray at the horizon in the way it does in the last hour before actual dawn. She was aware of Calum standing beside her. Not behind her now, but beside, which was a small adjustment of position that she registered with the part of her that registered small adjustments of position. "What are you thinking?" he said. She said, "That I've lived in that territory for 24 years, and I don't feel the way I expected to feel about leaving it. How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. "Like I'm exhaling after holding my breath for a very long time," she said, "which is somewhat uncomfortable, and also a relief." He made a sound that was becoming, she had noticed, increasingly recognizable as the sound of someone who would laugh, if laughing felt more natural, which it didn't yet, but was getting closer to. He said, "You were their archivist for 4 years. Yes. And before that, you were their cook's assistant. And before that, you were your father's embarrassment. And before that, you were the human woman's daughter, who nobody wanted to take responsibility for." She turned to look at him. He had been listening, across all those mornings, to everything she said, including the things she said about herself, which she had not always said directly, but had embedded in the history she was telling him, in the texture of her examples, in the specific details she chose to include. He had been assembling a picture of her, the way she had assembled a picture of him, quietly and thoroughly, and with the precision of someone who genuinely wants to know the thing they are learning. She said, "That's an accurate summary," he said, "and now you are the woman who kept the history alive for 400 years and found the voice to bring it home." He paused. "I would suggest that's a more accurate summary of who you actually are." Seren stood at the eastern boundary of Thornwood territory in the last hour before dawn and felt, for possibly the first time in her adult life, the specific and somewhat dizzying sensation of being seen. Not assessed, not calculated, not evaluated for threat or usefulness, or the potential inconvenience of her knowledge. Seen, with the complete and unambiguous acknowledgement of a person who has been paying attention for the right reasons. She said, after a moment, "We should keep moving." "Yes," he said. And they did. "Stay with me through this, because this is the moment the whole story has been building to, and if you want to know how they survive what comes next, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I promise you, what the elders are about to do will take your breath away." The pursuit, when it came, was faster than she had anticipated, and more organized than the elders usually managed. She would learn later that, the moment her absence was confirmed, Elder Marin had not convened a council meeting or issued a formal search protocol. She had contacted, directly and without involving the wider pack, 3 individuals who were known in Thornwood's unofficial architecture as the Marin's people, which was what the unranked community called the small network of operatives the Elder had maintained for decades to handle matters the council preferred to address without official record. This was information Seren had not had. She had known about the unofficial network in the abstract, from observations over 4 years, but she had not known its specific composition or its activation protocol. She became aware that something was moving through the forest behind them, approximately 2 hours east of the boundary, and the awareness arrived not through sound or sight, but through the sudden change in Calum's behavior. He stopped walking, turned his head slightly to the left and said, with a very specific quality of calm, 3, northwest angle, moving faster than we are. She did not ask how he knew. She said, "How far?" 20 minutes, less if they identify our path correctly. She calculated. 20 minutes of forest, no clear path east, and she was carrying a pack that was heavy enough to be a problem on difficult terrain. She was not, she acknowledged with the honest self-assessment she always applied to herself, physically built for speed. She was built for endurance, and for sitting at tables reading things, which were not the same skill set. She said, "There's a river crossing approximately 40 minutes north of our current position. The map showed a footbridge in the old survey, which may or may not still exist, but there's also a ford point that was stable as of the last update I found, which was 200 years ago. So the word stable is doing some work in that sentence. She paused. If we reach the ford before they close the angle, we can cross and the water will break the track. 40 minutes north while they close from the northwest, he said. We lose ground. We gain water between us and them. He considered this for approximately 2 seconds. Then, lead. She led. They went north at a pace she said as fast as she could maintain over rough terrain, which was not as fast as she would have liked, but was, she found, faster than she had believed herself capable of, when the alternative was capture by people who had spent 40 years making sure she never had access to anything that could threaten their arrangements. She did not think about capture. She thought about the terrain, the specific topography she had read in the old surveys, the way the ground would behave under their feet, the location of the ford. Caleb moved beside her with the completely unhurried fluidity of something that is not exerting itself, which she noted in the part of her mind that was cataloging everything, regardless of whether this was an appropriate moment for cataloging. He was fully reintegrated. He moved through the forest, the way a current moves through water, without friction, without announcement, without the specific human quality of having to navigate terrain, because for him the terrain was not something to navigate, but something he was in a relationship with. The old manuscript had called him of the place. She understood that now in a way she hadn't before, watching him move beside her through the forest that predated Thornwood by centuries. They reached the ford. The bridge was gone, but the ford was there, the same stable crossing the old survey had recorded, though the river was running higher and colder than she would have preferred. She stood at the bank for a moment, and then waded in without hesitation, because hesitation was not an available option, and the cold hit her like a physical argument she didn't have time to have. The water was knee-deep at the shallowest crossing and thigh-deep at the center, and she moved, through it holding her pack above the surface, and thinking about absolutely nothing except the far bank and the placement of each foot on the slippery stones. Caleb crossed beside her. The water did not seem to inconvenience him in the way it inconvenienced her. This was, she thought, entirely fair, given the relative circumstances of their natures, and she would have found it irritating if she hadn't been too busy finding the far bank. She found it. She hauled herself out and kept moving north. And east now, up the slope away from the water, into a thicker section of the eastern forest that would make the crossing point harder to identify from behind. She didn't stop until the sound of the river had faded to a general background presence rather than a specific location. And then she stopped and put her hands on her knees and breathed. Caleb stood beside her, not out of breath, watching the direction they had come from with his head tilted slightly. Have we lost them? She managed. Temporarily, he said. Then, after a moment, you should rest. We should keep moving. You're cold, and you've been moving quickly for 2 hours. If you don't rest now, you'll be moving slowly in an hour, which is worse than resting now and moving well in 20 minutes. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who has said something logical and is waiting to see if logic will be received or if stubbornness will win. She recognized this expression from her own face in various arguments she had had with herself over the years. She sat down. He did not sit down immediately. He stood at the edge of the clearing for a few moments, and she watched him with the same attentiveness she brought to everything and thought about what she was seeing. A being who had been sealed for 400 years, now standing in the world he had been removed from, in a forest that had grown and changed across all those centuries, with the full sensory and cognitive engagement of someone who is encountering something they have been waiting to encounter. The trees, the air, the particular quality of the world as it actually was, rather than as he had known it in the dimming memory of long before. His face, when he turned toward her, was doing something she had not seen it do before. It was open in a way that the careful, controlled recovery of the reintegration had not allowed. Something behind his eyes that was not the tactical intelligence she had been mapping over. These weeks, but the older, more fundamental quality that the tactical intelligence was built on. Wonder. The genuine encounter with the world as present and real and worth the full weight of attention. She said, "How does it feel?" He said, "Like I had forgotten that things were this real." She understood that, to her particular bones. She said, "Yes, They stayed in the clearing for 20 minutes, which was exactly how long she had allowed herself, and in those 20 minutes they did not speak very much. They listened to the forest, which was doing everything forests do in late October in the early morning, and she thought about the strange, specific gravity of this moment, the two of them on the far side of a river, with pursuit behind them, and nothing guaranteed ahead, and how it contained, despite everything, something that she could only describe as the sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She was not a person who had ever had that feeling before. She noticed it with the careful precision she brought to everything worth noticing. They found by midday what they were looking for. Not safety exactly, but the margin of it that counts as a working alternative. The nearest human town was a place called Harwick, population small enough to not require the kind of social navigation that larger human centers demanded, large enough to have the anonymous infrastructure of an economy that didn't track individuals. Seren had been there exactly once, on a supply run, and had observed it with the quiet thoroughness she brought to every new environment. She knew where the guest house was. She knew the general commercial layout. She knew, from her reading, the specific human social protocols she would need to navigate without the rank markers that structured pack society. She was, it turned out, better at human social navigation than pack social navigation. This was not surprising in retrospect. She negotiated a room at the guest house with the precise amount of friendly competence that makes transactions smooth without making people memorable, which was a skill she had developed long before she understood it as a skill. She paid from her coat lining reserve. She did not explain Calum, who stood slightly behind her during the negotiation with the composed presence of someone who has decided that letting the other person lead is the correct strategic choice and is executing that decision with complete conviction. The guest house owner asked no questions beyond the transactional, which was the specific gift of human service economies. The room was small and had 2 narrow beds and a window that looked out onto the town's main street, and it was the safest place Seren had been in 3 weeks. She sat on the edge of the bed that she mentally assigned to herself and thought about what came next, which was a different kind of thinking than the immediate tactical problem of the past hours. What came next was not escape. What came next was purpose. Calum sat in the chair by the window and looked out at Harwick with those gold eyes and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Tell me what you think should happen." She appreciated the phrasing. Not what will happen or what I intend to do, but what you think should happen. The deliberate invitation to her perspective before he brought his own to bear on it. She had been doing this in small ways for weeks. This specific orientation toward her as a source of judgment worth consulting, and she was still in the process of adjusting to it without visibly adjusting to it, which was its own small ongoing internal project. She said, "The seal is broken. You're here. That's already changed the fundamental situation in ways the elders can't undo. They can try to contain information about your return, but information has a specific quality when it involves something as significant as the first re-entering the world, which is that it doesn't stay contained. People will know. Within weeks, certainly. Within days, if any of the operatives from last night talk, which they will, because people do." She paused. "The Elder's power in Thornwood is based on the absence of a higher authority. The original pack law, as it existed before the seal, recognized you as the foundational authority. That authority hasn't been extinguished. It's been suppressed. Once it's known that you're back, the legal and political structure that the Council has been operating under becomes retroactively invalid. They built 400 years of structure on a suppression," he said. "The structure won't simply dissolve." "No," she said, "but it becomes contestable, in ways it wasn't before. People who have been living within the structure and resenting it now have a basis for that resentment. People who have been waiting for the authority to be legitimate now have a legitimate authority." She looked at him. "That's the context. The question is what you do with it. What do you think I should do with it?" She thought carefully before answering, because this was the kind of question she had been thinking about since she first read Manuscript 5 and understood what she was reading, since she had first seen the fear on Elder Voss's face, since she had spent 4 years in an archive room learning everything about a system that had been built on a lie. She said, "I think you should not do what they're afraid you'll do." He raised an eyebrow, which was a gesture she had watched him relearn. "The physical mechanics of over the past few weeks. And what are they afraid I'll do? Take power. Return to what you were before. Reassert authority through force, because force is what you have and what they violated." She paused. "That's what they do, in your position. So that's what they fear. But if you do that, you make their erasure of you partially correct. You become the dangerous power that needed to be controlled. You validate the narrative they've built around your absence." He looked at her for a long moment. She kept her eyes level. "What I should do instead," he said. "Change the structure," she said. "Not replace one authority with another. Dismantle the arrangements that made the suppression possible in the first place." The seal worked because power was concentrated in 7 people who were answerable to no one. The council that formed after the seal worked for the same reason. If you return not as the new top of a hierarchy, but as the person who dismantles the arrangement that made hierarchies possible, you change the situation permanently. Revolutions can be reversed. Systemic change is much harder to undo. Caleb was quiet for a long time. She let the quiet be. Outside, Harwick was conducting its midday business, the ordinary human commerce of a small town, and the sound of it came through the window without urgency. Then he said, "You've been thinking about this for longer than I have." 4 years, she said. "At least. Before you knew I was real. Before I knew you were real. Yes. I thought about what it would mean if the old structure were restored, and what it would mean if it were reformed, and whether those were the same thing or completely different things." "What did you conclude?" "That restoration is always a trap," she said. "Because you're restoring a world that no longer exists to people who have never lived in it, using it as a template for arrangements that serve the people proposing the restoration. Reform is messier and slower, and nobody gets exactly what they wanted, but it builds something that belongs to the present, rather than being borrowed from the past." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, something in the territory between the gold-eyed watchfulness she had come to know and something newer, something that might have been the specific quality of looking at a person and understanding them in a way that changes the nature of the looking. He said, "You should have been an elder." She laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh rather than the polite social approximation. She said, "I was the person they gave the archive to because nobody else wanted it." "Yes," he said, "and that's why you're the only person in Thornwood who is qualified to determine what should happen next." She held that. She held it the way you hold something you're not quite sure is real, checking its weight and consistency, verifying that it will remain solid under continued examination. It remained solid. She said, "We should sleep. We have a significant amount of work ahead of us." "Yes," he said. He said it with the warmth of someone who has been waiting a very long time to have significant work ahead of them, and has found, unexpectedly, someone he wants to do it with. If you're not yet subscribed to this channel, I need you to do that right now, because the next part of this story is going to require you to be prepared, and I cannot protect you from what the elders are planning. If you're not here when I tell you about it, they spent 4 days in Harwick. In those 4 days, Seren wrote. She had been writing her analysis for weeks in the cipher notebooks, but what she wrote now was different. Not analysis, but documentation, a formal account, in plain language, of everything she had found in the archive, every connection she had traced, every conclusion she had drawn, supported by the materials she carried, and by her own testimony as a trained archivist and by the corroboration of the individual whose existence the documentation was largely about. She wrote it in the way she would have written an official pack record, with the precision and formality of documents meant to serve as evidence, because that was what it was. Evidence. The full documented account of what the Thornwood Council had done 400 years ago, what they had been doing since, what the seal was, and why it had been placed, and what its placement had cost the pack in terms of its own. Authentic history and legitimate governance. Calum read it as she wrote it. He made corrections where his memory and her documentation diverged, which was 3 times, each correction minor, each adding a dimension to the historical record that she had not been able to access from the manuscripts alone. He also made no complaint about the project, which she had half expected, not because she thought he would object, but because she had learned in her life that people with power over situations frequently found documentation to be a somewhat irritating imposition on the more immediate and satisfying option of simply acting. He did not find it irritating. He found it, she thought, correct, in the specific sense of something that is being done rightly. On the 4th morning, she finished the document. She had 3 copies. 1 in the original handwritten version, 1 typed on the guest house's shared computer, and 1 sent via the encrypted email service she had set up years ago for precisely the kind of contingency she was too cautious to fully specify, to an address she controlled from outside the PAC's network. Then she looked at Calum and said, "Ready," he said. "Ready." They went back to Thornwood. The return was not dramatic. She had not designed it to be dramatic, because drama in her experience was what you resorted to when you lacked better options, and she had spent 4 years specifically building better options. What she had designed was this. She and Calum would arrive at the PAC's eastern boundary at the time of the monthly assembly, which was the one occasion in Thornwood's calendar when every PAC member was present in the same space, and announcements could not be restricted to selected audiences. She would enter with the documentation. She would present it. What she had not designed was the full reaction of the PAC when they saw Calum, which was not something documentation could fully prepare for. The monthly assembly was held in the central hall, and they arrived as it was in session, and the effect of their entrance was a specific quality of collective stillness that she had never experienced before. The stillness of a large group of people who are simultaneously registering something they cannot explain and something they somehow recognize. PAC memory is long, even when official records are short. Something in the assembled Thornwood members responded to Calum's presence with a body knowledge that their minds hadn't caught up to yet, a cellular recognition of something that had been absent for so long it had become a ghost story, and was now, suddenly, and without announcement, physical. Elder Voss rose from his seat. His face was doing something that was no longer fear alone, but had moved into the specific territory of someone whose long-held, carefully maintained arrangement is visibly collapsing in real time. He said, "This assembly is not the place for..." Seren set the documentation on the central table. She set it in the particular way she had set documents her whole professional life, with precision and clarity and without drama, because clarity was more effective than drama, and she had always known this. She said, "My name is Seren Ashvale. I am the Thornwood archivist. I have a formal historical and legal record to present to the full assembly, pursuant to PAC Law Article 12, which guarantees every PAC member the right to present evidence of record to a full assembly without prior council approval." She had read Article 12 in her first year in the archive, and had committed it to memory with the specific foresight of someone who understands that rights only matter if you remember they exist. The hall was silent. She presented it. She was not a public speaker. She had not been in a room with this many people giving her attention since she had raised her hand in this same hall 4 years ago. But she had spent 4 years talking clearly and precisely to a consciousness that needed complete information delivered without distortion, and that practice had made her something she hadn't been before, a person who could speak in complete sentences about complex things without needing the audience's approval while she was doing it. She spoke for 40 minutes. She covered the historical record, the seal's construction, the erasure of Calum from the official documents, the council's maintenance of the suppression across generations, the identification of the 2 remaining seal holders, the concealment of the manuscripts, and the return of the first. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The facts were sufficient. When she finished, the hall was doing the particular kind of silent that is not absence of noise, but the presence of an enormous amount of processing, happening simultaneously in a large number of people who have just received information that changes the architecture of everything they thought they knew about where they lived. Elder. Mirren stood. She looked at Seren with the calculation still running, And then she looked at Calum, with the fear that was no longer quite fear, but had become something more complicated. The complex response of someone who has been responsible for something for 40 years and has now run out of road. She said with remarkable composure, "What do you want?" It was directed at Calum. Calum looked at Seren. This was a gesture that the assembly would have registered as deference or as consultation, or as something else depending on their framework for understanding such things. But what it actually was, she knew, was the specific communication of someone who has agreed on a shared position and is confirming that the moment to express it has arrived. She gave a slight nod. He said to Elder Marin, in a voice that was entirely contemporary modern pack language now, no trace of the old dialect's halting quality, the full resonance of someone who has crossed 400 years and landed completely in the present. Reform. A new governance structure. Council seats filled by election rather than appointment. Legal protections for all pack members regardless of rank or wolf bond status. A revised and complete historical record made publicly available. The seal obligations dissolved upon the death or willing withdrawal of the 2 remaining holders. He paused. Specifically, no punishment for the archivist. The specific last sentence landed in the assembly with the quality of something that surprises because it is not what you expected from a being who had just reclaimed 4 centuries of suppressed authority. Seren heard it, and felt the weight of it, and did not allow her face to do anything except remain neutral, which required more effort than she was prepared to admit. Elder Marin was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "And if the council refuses?" Calum said, "Then the pack decides, without the council." He let that land. "I would prefer not to remove you from consideration. Your institutional knowledge is useful, and your 40 years of service, whatever its complications, is real. But I am prepared to proceed without your participation, if you prefer that to negotiation." Elder Voss, who had been standing in the particular posture of someone whose strategy for this moment had not included the option of negotiation, said, "This is irregular." Seren said, "Article 12 guarantees assembly decision-making authority in matters of constitutional significance, Elder Voss. I'd also suggest reviewing Article 7, which concerns the rights of founding-level authorities in governance disputes." She paused. "I have both cited in the documentation." He sat down. The negotiations took 3 weeks. They were not simple, and they were not always civil. And there were moments when the outcome was genuinely uncertain, when the council's resistance stiffened into something that looked like it might become a formal split in the pack, rather than a reform of its structure. And those moments required the kind of patient, repeated engagement that Seren had always been better at than anyone gave her credit for. She spent those 3 weeks doing what she had always done, reading, preparing, identifying the specific pressure points where accurate information delivered at the right moment could shift a hardened position. She briefed Calum every evening. He carried the negotiations in the day. They worked, she thought, the way 2 people work, when they have each spent a long time being very good at something alone and have discovered, somewhat to their own surprise, that what they are good at fits together in a way that covers each other's gaps. Elder Crane resigned on the 7th day. His seal obligation dissolved with his formal statement of withdrawal, which he delivered in writing with the composure of someone who had been waiting, she suspected, for a legitimate reason to put it down. Elder Marin negotiated until the 14th day, and then agreed to the terms with modifications to the transition timeline that Seren privately assessed as reasonable, and that Calum accepted without argument because they were. Elder Voss held out until the 20th day, and then accepted, she suspected, not because he was convinced, but because he was realistic. And realism had always been, despite everything, his actual governing quality. The new governance structure was ratified at a full assembly on the 21st day. It established an elected council of 9, term limited, with a public archive of all council decisions and a formal process for historical documentation that was binding and maintained by an independent archivist. The position of independent archivist was not, technically, equivalent to any rank in the old system. It was something new, a position created specifically by the reformed structure, with authority that came from documentation rather than blood or wolf bond. The position was offered to Seren at the ratification assembly before the full pack. Elder Marin made the offer, which Seren thought was a deliberate choice and appreciated it as such. The calculation had concluded, and the conclusion it had reached was that the correct move was acknowledgement rather than resistance. She accepted. And this is the moment I've been waiting for, from the very beginning of this story, because this is not the moment the eagle appeared, or the moment the seal broke, or even the moment Seren walked into a dark forest to give her voice to something that needed it. This is the moment a woman who had spent 24 years being invisible accepted a position of formal, permanent, documented authority in the place where her invisibility had been required, and the weight of that is worth sitting with. Hit that subscribe button and the bell notification so you don't miss the epilogue, because what happens next is the part that will stay with you. The warden's house was repaired. This was one of the items in the Reformation Agreement that nobody had specifically stipulated, but that Calum had added to the structural recommendations in the document, a single line about the restoration of historically significant sites on Thornwood territory, and which Seren had confirmed and documented, and which the new council had approved as part of the cultural heritage provisions. Workers from the pack went north in the early spring and repaired the roof and repointed the stone and replaced the single narrow window with one that let in more light, and by the time the work was done, it was recognizable as what it had always been, a place that had been built to last. She went there on the first warm evening of that spring, walking the warden's path that was beginning to be used again, the overgrowth cut back, the stones of the path visible again after centuries of obscurement. She brought her 3 spiral-bound notebooks and the winter coat that had served as a portable archive and a lamp, which she didn't need because there was enough evening light, but which she brought out of habit. The specific habit of someone who has spent a long time making sure she could see even in conditions that were not designed for her visibility. Calum was already there. He was sitting on the repaired stone step outside the door, looking at the forest with the attentiveness that never fully turned off, and he looked up when she arrived with the specific quality of expression she had been watching develop. Across the months of this year, the expression of someone who has relearned how to expect something good. She sat down beside him on the step. The forest was doing what forests do on the first warm evening of spring. The specific activity of 1,000 things simultaneously returning from their winter suspension, and the sound of it was the sound of return, which she was beginning to understand was one of the most complex and durable sounds there is. He said, "How was the first council meeting?" She said, "Significantly less efficient than I would have liked. Elected councils are slower than appointed ones. This is both their primary weakness and their primary virtue, depending on what you're trying to accomplish." He said, "And what were you trying to accomplish today?" She said, "The formal establishment of the Historical Record Project. We're going to document everything. The complete history, including the parts that were suppressed. The council has agreed to make the archive publicly accessible, which means the pack will have access to its own real history for the first time in 4 centuries. She paused. "It will take years, probably a decade before it's reasonably complete, but it will be done." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said when you first told me about the documentation project that the archive goes with you wherever you go." "You said that," she said. "I said I'd miss the archive but not Thornwood. You told me the archive goes with me." "I remember what I said," he said. "I'm noting that I was correct." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the forest still, but there was something in the set of his shoulders and the slight change in his breathing that she had learned to read across these months as the signal of someone who is about to say something they have been considering for a while and have decided the moment has arrived. She waited. He said, "I would like to ask you something." She said, "All right." He turned to look at her then, and the evening light was the specific low golden light of spring, which is different from autumn's gold in the way that hope is different from memory, warmer and more directional, and it caught in his eyes and made the gold of them something that had no analog she could think of except itself. He said, In the old structure, before the council, before the seal, there was a specific role for the one who kept the stories, who maintained the truth of things, who was the keeper of memory. He paused. It was not a secondary position. It was not the person you gave the archive to because nobody else wanted it. It was the equal standing of the one who holds the past to the one who holds the present. She said very carefully, "I'm aware. I read the description of it in manuscript 4. I know you did," he said, "which is why I'm asking, rather than simply proposing because you understand what you'd be accepting." He paused again, and she could hear in the pause the 400 years of someone who has learned, across a very long time of absence, that the things worth having are worth asking for rather than taking. Would you accept that standing? With me. Not as a formality, but as the actual function. The equal weight of the keeper of memory beside the one who walks the land. Seren sat on the repaired stone step of the warden's house, in the first warm evening of spring, and heard the question, and did not answer it immediately, because she had always believed that important questions deserved the time it took to answer them honestly, rather than quickly. She thought about the 8 mornings in a cold forest, speaking to inhabited silence. She thought about a notebook cipher no one else could read. She thought about the specific quality of being listened to fully, of being answered honestly, of being seen as the primary version of herself, rather than an inconvenient secondary category. She thought about a winter coat with manuscripts in the lining, and a blade of afternoon light moving across a dusty floor, and 11 documents that someone with the initial V had hidden, rather than destroyed, because even in the act of concealing truth, there is sometimes a person who cannot bear to fully lose it. She thought about the word keeper. She thought about how she had spent her whole life keeping things without knowing that was what she was, and how finding out had not felt like discovery but like recognition. She said, "Yes." He exhaled. It was a small sound, the exhale of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time, and has now received it, and she heard in it the accumulated weight of 400 years of patient suspension, reaching its conclusion in a single breath of release. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and the evening moved around them, and the forest continued its complicated business of return, and the warden's house stood in the amber light of spring, with the solid irreversibility of something that had been built to last, and had, after everything, lasted. Epilogue. 5 years later, the Thornwood Historical Archive Project released its first complete volume. It ran to 312 pages. The cover read, "Thornwood, A Complete History, Volume 1, Beginning at the Beginning." The dedication page said, "For V, who kept it, and for everyone who kept it after." Seren wrote it. She wrote all of it, across 5 years of research and drafting and revision, and the particular sustained attention that only she could have brought to it, because only she had spent 4 years memorizing everything, and another 5 years verifying and expanding and contextualizing what she had memorized. Calum contributed the sections covering the pre-seal period from his own memory, which were the sections that made the book extraordinary. The first-person account of a being who had been present at the founding of Thornwood and could describe it from the inside, in the specific detail that only presence produces. The book was read by every member of Thornwood Pack. It was also, because it turned out that truthful histories have audiences beyond their immediate communities, read by packs and communities beyond Thornwood, passed from hand to hand through the broader supernatural world with the specific energy of something that arrives at exactly the right moment. Other packs began asking questions about their own histories. Other archives began to be opened. The project that Seren had begun in a single room with a lamp and a spiral notebook became something with broader dimensions than she had planned for, which was, she thought, the usual behavior of things done well. The council elections produced, over the 5 years, a rotation of representatives that included for the first time in Thornwood's official history an unranked member, then an Omega, then a former kitchen worker who turned out to have considerable talent for governance when the barrier that had prevented her from being considered was removed. These were not dramatic changes. They were the incremental results of a structure designed to produce them. and Seren filed them in the archive with the same careful precision she had always applied to documentation. Because the small changes are the real story. The dramatic moments are what everyone remembers. The small changes are what actually move the world. She and Calum lived in the warden's house. This was not a political arrangement or a symbolic one, though it was, inevitably, both. It was simply the place that had been built for the function they were performing together, the place that had stood for 400 years waiting for its occupants to return. They had a study on the north side where they both worked, and a fireplace that drew cleanly on cold evenings, and a window that had been replaced to let in more light. They had conversations that began in the morning and continued through the day and resumed after dinner, with the ease of two people for whom talking is not performance, but contact. They argued occasionally, with the specific caliber of argument that only happens between people who respect each other's intelligence enough to actually disagree, and they resolved those arguments with the combination of logic and stubbornness and fundamental goodwill that Seren privately thought was the most accurate description of how she wanted to live. She did not have a wolf. She never did. This became, over the 5 years, a fact that the new Thornwood filed alongside its other facts. Not a deficiency, not an absence, but a characteristic, one kind of power among others. Her memory remained perfect. She kept everything in it that was worth keeping, which was everything, because she had never been able to determine precisely where the line between worth keeping and not worth keeping was, and had long since decided that the cost of erring toward retention was lower than the cost of erring toward loss. Calum watched her work. He had always been, she thought, fundamentally a being of watchfulness, the original watcher of the land, and the 400 years of enforced absence had not changed that quality but had deepened it. He watched with the attention of something that has been deprived and has learned. From deprivation, the specific value of presence. He watched her the way people watch things they are grateful to be watching, and she felt that watching not as surveillance but as the particular warmth of being someone whose presence is wanted. She had not known, until she had it, how different that was from all the other forms of being present she had lived through. The managed visibility of the archive years, the strategic invisibility of her childhood, the constant calibration of someone who has never been in a room where their presence was simply welcome. She had not known how heavy it was to live without that, because you cannot feel the weight of something you have always been carrying. You can only feel it set down. She set it down. She had, in a cold forest in late October, speaking to inhabited silence, already begun to set it down, though she hadn't known that yet. She had set it down one morning at a time, in the specific and unheroic way that real change happens, not as a single dramatic choice, but as the accumulation of choices in the same direction until the direction becomes the life. On the morning the book was released, she stood at the window of the warden's house and watched the early light move through the spring trees with the quality of light that has not yet been organized by the day into something purposeful, still loose and ambient, and entirely itself. She held her morning coffee in both hands, which was a habit she had had for years and had never thought about until Calum had once observed it, precisely and without commentary, and the observation had made her aware of it as a thing she did, a specific physical signature of her particular relationship with warmth. He came to stand beside her. He was quiet in the way he was always quiet in the mornings, the slow return to full presence that even he, 400 years fully behind him now, still maintained as the morning's quality, and she had long since ceased to read his morning quiet as distance. It was, she had learned, the opposite, the quiet of someone who is sufficiently present that they do not need to fill the space with sound. She said, "It's out." He said, "I know, 312 pages. You've told me," he said, with the warmth in his voice that lived just under the composure, the warmth she had learned to hear without needing it to be performed, every day for the past month. She smiled. She had been, she acknowledged, somewhat focused on the book for the past month. Volume 2 will be longer. Of course it will. She looked out at the spring trees. An eagle passed overhead once, unhurried, gold in the early light. not circle. It did not need to. It had nothing left to announce. It moved through the sky above the warden's house, and the repaired stone and the window that let in more light. And it was simply there. The way things are simply there when they are where they belong. And then, it was gone into the north. She watched the empty sky for a moment after it passed. She said, "We kept it." And Caleb, who had been kept across 400 years of impossible patience, who had been given back to the world, by a woman who spoke to silence in a cold forest because someone needed to, reached over and folded his hand around hers on the warm ceramic of the cup and said, "We did. And that's the end of our story for today. If this one moved you, if you felt the weight of what it means to be kept and to keep, to be seen and to see, please leave a comment below. Tell me which moment got to you. Was it the first morning she walked into that forest? Was it when he said it never does? Was it the moment she accepted standing beside him, not as a secondary arrangement but as an equal function, a keeper beside the watcher of the land? I want to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now, because the next story I have for you carries the same weight, and the same love, and the same belief that the people everyone overlooks are carrying the most important things. I'll see you in the next one.